Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lecture series on understanding literary criticism and theory. By the way, we are meeting after a long period of time, particularly for sure. But prior to that, let me tell you what we have been discussing so far. We have talked about, by the way, if you remember, we have started talking about particularly literary criticism and theory. And in this uh, so far, we have talked about various theories that have been discussed by one of the prominent figures then, right? So we have talked about the various periods, and now we are prominently focusing on one of the prominent period is that is the romantic period in which literary criticism got flourished, and for that we are prominently focusing on few of the prominent figures like we have with us Wordsworth is there. Then we have Coleridge, right? And the next figure we are going to focus on is none other than P.B. Shelley. So we have got these prominent figures, by the way. And in the previous lecture series, we have talked about what does actually mean by the Romanticism, what Romanticism literally tries to cover up with. Exactly. So we have tried to focus on that particular part also, where we are able to where we have prominently talked about the significance of literary criticism in the Romantic period. Okay, so we have seen the background of a Romantic period, particularly where we have tried to understand how this Romantic idea, okay, it is nothing but a romantic period is not simply a period, but it can be considered, okay, as a kind of a movement that got started out of the classical thought, particularly, right? So when we try to check the background of this particular period, we realize that it was nothing but the various ideas that got greatly emerged in neoclassical period. Okay, many of the prominent figures of the neoclassical period who insisted on class, form, nature, then a lot of talent and practice, particularly, were a kind of a great importance to the classics, particularly that takes us towards Aristotle or Plato or a kind of a classical work that got produced. Okay, so somehow this kind of thought got greatly conceived in neoclassicism, and its excess somehow emerged into the result of the romantic ideas. Exactly. Now what does mean by romanticism? We also have tried to see what romanticism actually means. Exactly. It started like a movement only, where the literary monks particularly gave a great of importance, kind of a greater importance to the thought that there should be a subject matter close to the nature. Exactly. So we have seen that going close to the nature, exactly, going close to the nature, then exactly believing in rustic life. Rustic life means making simple people, the common people, common man, a farmer or somebody working in a farm should be uh, he should be also kind of like a subject matter of the poetry, kind of a thought was there, and by that this romantic idea got spread, particularly when we try to find out, especially in the 18th and 19th century, we have seen particularly these ideas getting greatly popularized otherwise. Okay, so when we try to find out the greatest work of William Wordsworth and Coleridge, who are considered as the father of William Wordsworth, particularly being a popular figure of Romantic period, also considered as one of the prominent figure in English literary criticism, marks a kind of this event with its great kind of excellence and his talents, particularly, right? So his excellency, his talent, it can be notified through various works. The lyrical ballads, preface to lyrical ballads. Exactly, his are prominent works, and different several of his poetries in which we find what criticism he has discussed in his the theories that he has discussed. We have seen him literally using those theories in his work, particularly, right? So this makes a kind of a great sense to understand how his work has been a one of the remarkable factor, particularly when it comes to understand Wordsworth. Okay. So in the previous lecture, we have tried to focus on the significance of those prominent figures, particularly in case of understanding. So Wordsworth, whatever definitions of poetry are put forth by Wordsworth, his idea of poetry, his way of talking about imagination, his defense of choosing the rustic language, his defense for opting, his defense for overthrowing classical ideas, his defense for overthrowing, the classical attitude and bringing back, going close to the nature. Exactly, his defense or his critical approach while explaining how, being in a contact or being close to the nature, also following the rustic life, choosing, there are various factors that we have seen in previous lecture that we have seen. So which are they? So आपण त्या लेक्चर मध्ये बघितलं की वर्ड्सवर्थ प्रॉमिनंटली काय फोकस करतोय, तर वर्ड्सवर्थ फोकस करतोय एक गोष्ट प्रॉमिनंटली, तो म्हणजे काय म्हणतो की निसर्गाकडे परत चला. जे काय ओरिजिनेट होतंय ते निसर्गामधून ओरिजिनेट होतंय. So this is also one of the factors that why he is called as a nature poet particularly, right? So he's a insist on going back to the nature. He's a insist on understanding, in a way, the prominent figure, particularly who is known as William Wordsworth, who is also considered the proponent of romantic period, right? मग त्यामध्ये विलियम वर्ड्सवर्थने काय काय आयडियाज सांगितल्या, तर like when you choose, he has recommended the further writers when they choose poetry, in case of considering the subjectivity, the language. He has talked about the language of the poetry. He has also talked about the subject of the poetry, theme of the poetry, where you should take clothes of nature. So mountains, rivers, valleys, the green forest, they all have got a kind of a greater importance, and they become the elements. They become the elements of subject, particularly when the when the literaries in romantic period chose particularly, right? So we have seen various factors, where we have come up with a very famous definition provided by William Wordsworth that says poetry is powerful, poetry. Poetry is, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, or which re-originate in tranquility. So you have got excitement, it should be within, exactly. So giving much of value to expressions, emotions, feelings, a kind of a quality we can see with this particularly. So we have tried to understand how significantly William Wordsworth, with the various lectures, have, in a way, tried to explain uh, the significance of romantic period particularly, right? So we have tried to understand what is the, the prominent quality that we notice particularly when it comes to understand the work of William Wordsworth. Otherwise, in today's session we are going to focus on S.P. Coleridge and P.B. Shelley and their prominent work particularly, but it is much more important to revise what we have been discussing so far, so we can shift to our new critic from romantic period, and one more another critic from romantic period who have greatly contributed, right? Prior to that, let's just go and revise what we have been discussing so far, talking about particularly romantic period. Exactly. So we have tried to understand its historical context, particularly the various ideas that were put forth, and what it literally talks about. Then we have talked about the philosophy and spirit, particularly. So imagination is the creative power, got a great importance. There's the emphasis to emotions and subjectivity. Nature as a source of inspiration had got decided over there. The interest of the past and supernatural power, which we can see was there in the Shakespearean era, particularly going back to this. So medievalism, folklore, myths, and Gothic were revived, right? Then individualism was there, and freedom was there. So they celebrated the individual genius and outcast the rebel and visionary. So idealism and revolution was there. Now talking about various features, क्या क्या फीचर्स देखने को मिलते हैं, क्या क्या हम इसमें देख सकते हैं, या मध्ये काय काय बघू शकतो बघा. Lyricism and poetry as a central form. Exactly, poetry, became the most important literary part, particularly a form, okay, which used, best express the emotions and imagination. Now talking about language, the sample, the simple and natural language became one of the greatest sample of this romantic period. या romantic period मध्ये काय महत्त्वाचा बदल बदल झालेला दिसतो, तर तो असा की use of simple language, use of language of a common man, and the theme of childhood and innocence, then sublime and mysteriousness, and the celebration of common man. Unlike neoclassical elitism, romantic literature gave importance to the farmers, shepherds, and ordinary rural life. Exactly. So that's why it is considered as a movement rather. Now going back to its history again, how this got particularly started. Okay, so we realize that the 18th century and mid-18th century, it emerged as a powerful reaction against the Enlightenment or Age of Reason and Neoclassicism. Okay, now this period itself is considered a period of revolution. If we try to understand various political things that were taking place in this period, काही राजकीय उलथापालथ देखील या शतकामध्ये किंवा या सेंचुरीमध्ये होत होत्या की ज्याचा एक ओव्हरऑल परिणाम म्हणून, एक्झॅक्टली, cities were crowded. Exactly. Taking about so असंही म्हणतात की एन्व्हायरमेंटल फ्रेंडली एन्व्हायरमेंटल फ्रेंडली थॉटला कुठे कन्सिव्ह केलं गेलं तर ते रोमॅन्टिक पिरियडमध्ये कन्सिव्ह केलं गेलं because we try to understand that how this got continually, right? When we try to understand the philosophy or the basic elements of romantic period, we realize that their call to go back to the nature was quite important. So त्या काळामधल्या काही महत्त्वाच्या घटना म्हणजे काय तर सिटीज वर क्राउडेड, इंडस्ट्रियल रिव्होल्युशन, त्यामुळे होणारी कॅपिटलिस्ट आणि capitalists became more powerful or rich and the poor became poorer. A kind of a thought was there, and as employment was only available in cities, people gathering in cities and in a great number was also seen or noticed particularly. So तो एक मोठा फॅक्टर यामध्ये लक्षात येतो की ज्यामुळे शहरांमध्ये गर्दी वाढली होती आणि मग त्यामुळे कुठेतरी शहरांचं आकर्षण फार वाढलं होतं क्लासिकल एजमध्ये, एज ऑफ रिझनमध्ये. हा एक थॉट आहे. त्यामुळे साध्या लोकांकडे, सामान्य लोकांकडे कोण बघणार? So that became a great importance, and also the French Revolution also laid a laid a foundation somehow to the bringing back or emergence of or this newly emerging romantic thought particularly, right? When we try to find out the spirit. Exactly. They believed the truth could be grasped only through the logic, but also through emotions, intuitions, and aesthetics. Neoclassical लोकांनी reason वरती, reasoning वरती जास्त prominently focus केला होता. Whereas the romantic period सांगितलं की romantic criticsनी, romantic काळातल्या criticsनी हे सांगितलं की असं काही नाहीये की तुम्हाला जो आनंद मिळणार आहे, तुम्हाला जे सत्य शोधायचं आहे, your thirst of finding the truth, can not just only can be used or can be accessed by using the logic and reason particularly, but emotions, intuitions, and aesthetic experiences also are the ways through which you can express truth and also you can find the truth, right? So imagination got a kind of a greater amount of importance. Now talking about the prominent figures of this period, we must not miss out these prominent figures particularly, right? We have got William Wordsworth, who has written his preface to lyrical ballads, then also has published his lyrical ballads, then Prelude and Tintin Abbey are the famous works that we notice particularly. Then we have got S.T. Coleridge, his the Rime of Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan are the prominent, are the famous poems that he has produced. Talking about his work, Biographia Literaria is also one of the prominent literary work that he has produced, and it is of a much more importance to understand what he has tried to explain through that word particularly, right? We have got another prominent figure of second generation. There is no William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, S.T. Coleridge are considered as the prominent figures of first generation romantics. Now second generation romantics we have with us is Lord Byron and P.B. Shelley, are again the two prominent figures of romantic period and very famous poets rather in English literature who have greatly contributed, right? So the Byronic hero, particularly Don Juan or the Child Herald's Pilgrimage, are the prominent works that include in Romantic period, particularly by Lord Byron. Right. Then we have with us P.B. Shelley, his Ode to the West Wind, and the Prometheus Unbound are the championing freedom of and revolution. The transformative power of imagination can be noticed in his poems, particularly. Right. Then we have John Keats, again one of the very prominent figure of Romantic period, whose work is yet appreciated greatly and has been studied by many universities and as a part of various curriculums in English literature particularly is a prominent figure, is John Keats. Now talking about prose and essays, we have Charles Lamb, then we have William Hazlitt, Thomas De Quincey is we have with us, then novels, a gothic novel, historical novel, then we have got a novelist like a Jane Austen who produced, and talking about the themes, nature and the sublimity. So mountains, rivers, forests, and seas were described with the awe and reverence. Then imagination versus reason was kind of a great, conflict particularly, or kind of a defensive mode on which they started talking about particularly, right? Then we have got a freedom and revolution, mystery and supernatural, melancholy are the prominent parts, beauty and art. Now talking about the legacy, it also included kind of a various, it had a kind of a great legacy as we have seen the prominent figures from first generation, second generation, and we have got prominent novelists also. So in a way, Romantic period marks a kind of a revolutionary change in the history of English literature, right? Now the classicals, then Puritan period, then bringing back the neoclassical ideas. There are a lot of rely on logic and reasoning for finding the truth, their philosophical angle, and being going towards going back to the classicals are the prominent figures for sure. But when they were overthrown and a kind of a simple language, a language of a common man, a common man should be a subject matter of our communication was kind of a thought that got conceived. It became, initially, though it sounded quite, simple one, very normal one, but it became like a movement, and many prominent figures going close to the nature, accepting nature as the source of their inspiration for producing literature, is seen a remarkable change, which brought or a remarkable change, or we can see a kind of a paradigm shift in case of putting forth your ideas, emotions, expressions, valuing literature. The values that that got conceived in literature are the prominent factors which we should not miss when it comes to talk about literature particularly, right? So this was all about the overall background of romantic period. We also have seen what William Wordsworth has tried to say in the previous lectures. Now let us go and begin with what particularly S.T. Coleridge has to say. Yes, so here is the information about S.T. Coleridge, being one of the prominent figure of English literature particularly. He is considered as a prominent figure in case to understand, a lyrical poet, critic, and a philosopher. His lyrical ballads written with William Wordsworth heralded the English Romantic movement, and prominently his individual work, which is known as a Biographia Literaria, that got published in 1817, remains one of the prominent work, particularly that produced, the literary criticism in the English Romantic period in a significant way. Right, now, talking about his literary, Biographia Literaria, which is an extensive work that includes, the intellectual autobiography, philosophy, and literary theory. Though a few critics or some critics praised the insight and originality of this work, viewing Coleridge as the first English romantic critic who have structured or who has brought a philosophical angle in literary criticism particularly. Thus, it is much important to understand his work particularly. Exactly. So he is rewarded. He has been appreciated for building the literary criticism on philosophical foundations particularly. So he was mainly focused on the a creative process rather than the final product. Exactly, enjoying the process, being part of the process, and making it more creative, not without worrying about the final product that you produce particularly, right? So your focus should be on the process and making it more of creative, was a kind of thought that got conceived when we see the work of S.T. Coleridge in his various critical explanations on literature particularly. Ah, he tried to explain through his own words that to establish the principles of writing rather than to furnish the rules how to pass judgment on what has been written by others. Exactly. So creating your own creativity rather than just making, complaints in air is of no use particularly. नुसतं हवेत गप्पा मारण्यापेक्षा आपण आपल्या कामामधनं ते कसं सिद्ध करू शकतो याचं एक उत्तम उदाहरण एस टी कोलरेजने इकडे घालून दिलेलं दिसतं, राईट. And so his Biographia Literaria is one of the prominent works which is yet referred by many prominent figures in case of studying English literature and literary criticism. So his criticism, when we try to find out his overall work, we find him it is scattered in various books particularly, and his writings, and particularly his lectures, like his lectures on Shakespeare, then other prose writing like The Friend, the Table Talk, or his write-ups in particularly Omniana, or the letters and the posthumous Anima Poetia, etc. are his other works. So वेगवेगळ्या सेक्शन मध्ये किंवा वेगवेगळ्या पुस्तकांमध्ये एस टी कोलरिजने केलेलं काम दिसतं, असं एकदम विस्तृतपणे पसरलेलं दिसतं किंवा एकदम असं सगळीकडे विखुरलेलं आहे. पण जेव्हा आपण कलेक्टिव्हली एस टी कोलरेजच्या आयडिओलॉजीचा, एस टी कोलरेजच्या थॉट प्रोसेसचा विचार करतो, तेव्हा ती आपल्याला कुठेतरी रोमॅन्टिक पिरियडकडे डेफिनेटली घेऊन जाते. आणि म्हणून विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थ आणि एस टी कोलरेजला फर्स्ट जनरेशन रोमॅन्टिक्स असं लेबलाइज केलं जातं. Now his theory of imagination, which is also quite a famous part of his literary criticism. Exactly. So what it says that his greatest and most original contribution to literary criticism is none other than his theory of imagination. Exactly, on which Addison had exclaimed that nature and function of imagination, and Wordsworth too had developed his theory on the subject. But all previous discussion of imagination looked superficial and childish when we compared with Coleridge's treatment of the subject. He is the first, critic to differentiate between imagination and fancy, right? And so to differentiate between primary and secondary imagination too. Exactly. Now, through the theories of imagination, he revolutionized the concept of artistic imitation, right? So the poetic imitation, according to him, in a way, is neither ah, sorry, apologies for the technical glitches otherwise. So when we try to find out his greatest of works, where he has tried to differentiate between imagination and fancy, and also has made a differentiation between primary imagination and secondary imagination. According to him, the poetic imitation is neither a servile copy of nature, but not it is the creation of something entirely new and different from nature. Now, poetry is not imitation but creation, but it is a creation based on the sensation and impressions received from the external world. Such impressions are shaped, ordered, and modified, and opposites are reconciled and harmonized by the imagination of the poet. And in this way, the poetic creation takes place. It's kind of a clear opinion that we find him making over here. Further, we find him, in a way, in his various chapters of Literaria Biographia, defining what is meant by fancy and imagination, how primary imagination differs from secondary imagination, and how fancy differs from imagination, how imagination remains highly appealing factor in case of creating, in case of labelizing creativity and the work that gets produced by extreme implementation of creativity particularly, right? So let us go and try to understand what he has tried to explain through these various chapters, particularly through his work Literaria Biographia, right? Now what he says in that is, in the first chapter of the Biographia, Coleridge describes fancy and imagination are not two names with one meaning or the lower and higher degree of the same power, but are two distinct and widely different faculties. Okay, in the chapter 13 of Literaria Biographia, he introduces the distinction between the two kinds of imagination, that is, primary imagination and secondary imagination. So, what is primary imagination according to him? It is the faculty by which we perceive the world around us. It is merely the power of receiving impressions of the external through our senses. It perceives objects both in their parts and as a whole. It is an involuntary act of the mind. Okay, so talking about imagination particularly, he says that it is nothing but a game of sensation and perceptions. You see certain things, you perceive them, you have got the memories of those pictures in you, and you try to imagine. It means it is a faculty. It is one of the prominent faculty in ways to try to understand what he has to say word to word, that it is merely the power of receiving impressions of the external through our senses, right? And so he says it perceives objects both in their parts and as a whole, and it is an involuntary act of the mind. Exactly. So primary imagination has got one of the attributes, that it is an involuntary act of mind. Exactly. So the human mind receives impressions and sensations from the outside world unconsciously and involuntarily. Now, by that, it imposes some sort of order on those impressions, reduces them size and shape, so that, pardon me, so that the mind can form a clear image of outside world. Exactly, and that's how the primary imagination takes place, where definitely, exactly, it tries to put something in that way, order otherwise. So it is in this way, it is in this way the clear and coherent perception becomes possible. He describes, Coleridge describes primary imagination as the mysterious power which can extract hidden ideas and meaning, you know, from objective data. Now, talking about secondary imagination, also, which is one of the prominent part taken into consideration, right? So, this remains as one of the prominent factor to understand his ideas again, about his style of defining what is meant by primary and what is meant by secondary, right? So let us go and try to understand what he wants to say in his idea of secondary imagination particularly, right? The primary imagination is universal and possessed by all. Exactly, we all have that faculty. So he says that primary imagination is something that exists in everybody, and this is the imagination which is universal and possessed by all. So in all of all the human beings, you find this kind of this primary imagination exists, which is gained through the sensation and perception process, where we have got images as a part to see them as a part or see them as a whole, and that appeals to the faculty, and it is done in an involuntary way or unconsciously. Now talking about secondary imagination, the secondary imagination makes artistic creation possible. This is the remarkable thing that differs secondary and primary, right? So it makes artistic creation possible, an effort of the will and conscious effort. Exactly. So secondary imagination is something that you make consciously and you have to put effort. Exactly. Yeah, whereas looking at primary imagination, we have seen defining him that primary imagination is something that happens unconsciously and the mind is involuntary in that process. And secondary imagination, you are quite purposeful, and so you are adding, exactly, you are adding your mind, you are fixing it, and you are making it imagine certain things by taking certain efforts. Exactly, it works upon what is perceived by the primary imagination. Exactly, the secondary imagination has a foundation of a primary imagination, and based on that, this secondary imagination, which is an act of deliverance, takes place particularly based on the secondary imagination, right? And its raw materials are the sensation and impression supplied to it by primary imagination. Now in case of taking secondary imagination, which is the artistic creation is possible only when we have a primary imagination. Exactly, प्रायमरी इमॅजिनेशन मध्ये ज्या गोष्टी कलेक्ट केल्या गेलेल्या आहेत त्याच्या आधारावरती एक डेलिबर्ड एफर्ट होतो, तेव्हा ते सेकंडरी इमॅजिनेशन विच इज अन आर्टिस्टिक क्रिएटिव्हिटी असं ज्याला लेबलाइज करताना कोलरी म्हणतो तिथे तयार होतं. Exactly, and it selects and orders the raw materials and reshapes and remolds it into objects of beauty. Exactly, त्याला ब्युटिफाय करण्याचं, त्याला ऑर्डरनी स्वतःच्या एका चेंज करण्याचं, सेट करण्याचं काम कोण करतं, तर अशा प्रकारची गोष्ट जेव्हा घडते. So he says that this makes kind of a greater difference when it comes to labelize it as a one of the acts that remains quite significant, right? So adding the beauty can take place with secondary imagination, as it is nothing but a voluntary act of a mind where mind is conscious and making deliberate effort with some kind of awareness for sure. Exactly, further that it exemplastic and dissolves and diffuses and dissipates in order to create. Exactly. So secondary imagination is the root of all poetic activity. This remains one of the remarkable statements by him. Exactly. It is the power that reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite and discordant qualities, and Coleridge calls it a magical synthetic power. एक्झॅक्टली ॲट इट डिफ्युजेस. एक्झॅक्टली जे आवश्यक आहे ते ठेवायचं त्याच्यामध्ये. प्रायमरी इमॅजिनेशनच्या बेसवरती तुमचं सेकंडरी इमॅजिनेशन बिल्ड होतं, आणि ते बिल्ड होत असताना ज्या काही वेगवेगळ्या प्रोसेसेस घडतात, एक्झॅक्टली त्या प्रोसेसला तो काय म्हणतोय की इट इज ए मॅजिकल सिंथेटिक पॉवर. ओके, काय मॅजिक द मॅजिक सिंथेटिकल पॉवर इज in a way the secondary imagination, right? So what it does, it joins the various faculties of the soul, subjective will with the objective, and the human mind with external nature, the spiritual with physical or material. Exactly, so you find these various qualities taking place when you are literally saying. Okay, so this statement remains quite significant over here. He says that it fuses the various faculties of the soul. Exactly, subjective with objective, the human mind with external nature, the spiritual with physical or material. Exactly, so secondary imagination matters the most in case of poetic creativity, as it is the power that reveals itself in the balance and recalculation of the discordant qualities. Exactly, the primary and secondary imagination do not differ from each other in the kind. The difference is only of degree, exactly the kind of intensity and the degree it says. So the secondary imagination is more active, more conscious, and more voluntary than primary one. Exactly, as they are interdependent. Primary imagination is the original one. Based on that, this secondary imagination takes place, on which the poetic creativity appeals. All kind of poetic creativity are based, or their foundation lays in secondary imagination. Is a kind of a statement we find this particular person making over there. Okay, so this remains one of the significant factor to understand what he has tried to explain in his literary biography about primary imagination and, in a way, secondary imagination. Now, the thoughts on fancy. Exactly what he has to said here. Imagination and fancy differ in kind and nature. Exactly, their forms are different and their nature is different. Exactly, their being, their appearance itself is very much different. That's what Coleridge makes sense. So म्हणतो की fancy खूप वेगळा आहे आणि imagination खूप वेगळा आहे. Exactly what he says. Okay, imagination is creative. Fancy, which is a common possession of man and it is not creative. Exactly. So the two, very important thing that he tries to say that imagination is a act of creativity, right? And fancy, fancy is not something that can be considered as creative. Exactly. So non-creative part कुठे येतो तो fancy मध्ये येतो, right? It is a mechanical process that receives the elementary images which come to it ready-made, and without altering these, fancy reassembles them into a different order from that in which it was received. फॅन्सी करतो म्हणजे काय करतो तर तो म्हणतो की फॅन्सीमध्ये तुम्हाला प्रायमरी सेकंडरी इमॅजिनेशन नुसार ज्या इमेजेस कलेक्ट होतात त्या इमेजेसला एक सर्टन ऑर्डर असते. ती ऑर्डर चेंज करून त्याला वेगळ्या वेळी मांडण्याची स्टाईल म्हणजे काय तर ती फॅन्सी आहे. याच्यामध्ये फक्त तुम्ही ज्या गोष्टी रिसीव्ह झाल्या, ज्या सेन्स झाल्यात, ज्या तुम्ही परसिव्ह केल्यात ना, त्या तुम्ही खूप वेगळ्या अँगलने मांडण्याचा प्रयत्न करता. एक्झॅक्टली काय करता तुम्ही? That in which it was received. Okay, let's make it again clear. Exactly what he states here, that it is a mechanical process. What it does, that receives the elementary images which come to it ready made. त्या कशा मिळतात रेडीमेड आणि त्या कशा विदाउट अल्टरिंग these, fancy resembles them, associates them into different order from that which it was received. ज्या ऑर्डरमध्ये रिसीव्ह झालं त्याच्यापेक्षा वेगळ्या ऑर्डरमध्ये सेट करण्याचं काय काम करतं फॅन्सी करतं. इट ओनली combines what it perceives into beautiful shapes. एक्झॅक्टली फॅन्सी करतो म्हणजे काय तर जे मिळाले ते वेगवेगळ्या शेप्समध्ये, वेगवेगळ्या आकारामध्ये, वेगवेगळ्या सायझेसमध्ये, वेगवेगळ्या प्रोसेसमध्ये, वेगवेगळ्या ऑर्डरमध्ये पुटअप करण्याचं काम करणं म्हणजे काय तर फॅन्सी. युअर फॅकल्टी ऑफ फॅन्सी perceives things, they are ready made perceived, exactly, and they are just changed with their order or maybe their size or their shape, and accordingly it takes place, but does not fuse or unify. त्याच्यामुळे त्यामध्ये युनिटी दिसत नाही, त्यांना जॉईन करत नाही, त्यांना एक करत नाही. एक्झॅक्टली इट इज अ काइंड ऑफ मेमरी that arbitrarily brings together images, and even when brought together, these images continue to retain their separate and individual properties. युनिफिकेशन नाहीये, युनिटी नाहीये, फ्युजन नाहीये, एकत्र आणण्याचं काम नाहीये. जरी त्या एका ऑर्डरमध्ये सेट केल्या असल्या तरी त्या एक इंडिव्हिज्युअल आयडेंटिटी आहेत हे दिसून येतं. हे फॅन्सी मध्ये होतं. एक्झॅक्टली दे रिसीव्ह इनटू no coloring or modification from the mind. Exactly, there is no modification. Exactly, mind receives them, and as they are received, exactly, they are set accordingly, right? So this basic difference has to be taken into consideration between fancy and imagination, right? What he further adds is a part of curiosity. Okay, so he has called fancy the aggregative and associative power. Exactly, what is mean by aggregative? When you have got different elements, okay, you set them, so it is in a way collective. Exactly, so talk about this particularly. What we have over here with us is nothing but to differentiate between the two prominent faculties we have with us, uh, is that have allowed us to say. Exactly, So, we have got many, to talk about aggregate. Exactly. Understanding what is meant by aggregate. Aggregate is, in a way, to comprehend particularly, is a sum total of many heterogeneous things that taken together. म्हणजे काय, तुमच्याकडे अनेक समान क्वालिटीच्या किंवा समान स्टेटसच्या गोष्टी आहेत ज्या तुम्ही कलेक्टिव्हली समोर ठेवता. दॅट इज ॲग्रिगेशन. एक्झॅक्टली. सो इट कॅन बी नंबर. सो ही सेज इट इज जस्ट अन असोसिएशन. तुम्हाला त्यांच्यामध्ये काहीतरी असोसिएटिंग फॅक्टर वाटतो, तुम्ही त्यांना एका सर्टन ऑर्डरमध्ये तुम्हाला परसिव्ह होण्याची गोष्टी वेगळी असते. एक्झॅक्टली. यू माइट परसिव्ह थिंग्स, यू माइट receive, you might sense things individually in different manner, but you arrange them according to your various associations. So what your mind does in that, it just associates them and puts them in an aggregative manner. So Coleridge levelizes this, that fancy मध्ये काय होतं, exactly according to him, exactly fancy the aggregative, right? We find him, no, I'm sorry, uh, referring to this very particular thought, where he says that it is nothing but, तो काय सांगतो की तो ॲग्रिगेटिव्ह आणि कलेक्टिव्ह आहे. म्हणजे काय, तर फॅन्सीमध्ये बऱ्यापैकी काय असतं, तर ॲग्रिगेशन आणि कलेक्शन बघायला मिळतं, की जे सगळ्यात महत्त्वाचा फॅक्टर आपण लक्षात घेतला पाहिजे. फॅन्सीमध्ये हा काय म्हणतात त्याला, सगळ्यात मोठा एक वेगळा पार्ट दिसतो, जो इथे एस टी कोलरेज आता आपल्या समोर इथे सांगताना दिसतोय. तो काय म्हणतोय त्याच्या डेफिनेशनमध्ये, लिटरेरी बायोग्राफीमध्ये, की फॅन्सीमध्ये इमॅजिनेशनपेक्षा फार वेगळं काय असतं का, तर नाही आहे. मग ते काय दिसतं, ते कुठे दिसतं, एक्झॅक्टली. So to liberalize that, he says exactly, yes, aggregative power. However, Wordsworth argued that to aggregate and to associate, to evoke and to combine belongs as well to imagination as to the fancy. कोलरिजने त्याला काउंटर पार्ट केला. कोलरिजने त्याला काउंटर पार्ट करून काय सांगितलं, कोलरिज म्हणतोय की ज्याप्रमाणे हे फॅन्सीच्या बाबतीत आहे, त्याचप्रमाणे हे कुठं आहे, तर हे इमॅजिनेशनच्या बाबतीत सुद्धा आहे. म्हणून तो काय म्हणतोय, Wordsworth argues that to aggregate and associate, to evoke and combine belong as well to imagination as to the fancy. But Coleridge explained that aggregating or collecting is beneath the dignity of, exactly, it is beneath the dignity of imagination, because it does not necessarily an act of uniting. Exactly. फॅन्सी मध्ये युनायटिंग नाही आहे, फ्युजन नाही आहे, एक्झॅक्टली डिफ्युजन आहे. इंडिव्हिज्युअल आयडेंटिटीज दिसतात. एक्झॅक्टली. तुम्ही जे इमॅजिन केले याचं, तो तुम्ही जे सेन्स केले, त्या सेन्स केलेल्या गोष्टींना एका सर्टन अमाऊंट म्हणजे तुम्ही ऑर्डरमध्ये सेट करता, पण त्या युनिफाईड दिसत नाहीत. त्यांची इंडिव्हिज्युअल आयडेंटिटी तरीही त्यातनं लेबलाइज होते, त्यातनं दिसून येते. राईट. अँड सो ही सेज the materials have to be assembled before imagination can get to work and make the transformation and synthesis. Fancy has to do this act of collecting, and so fancy presupposes imagination. Exactly, it presupposes imagination. So in a way, he has tried to explain the difference between fancy and imagination in a very particular way, where we find that how significantly he tries that. Exactly what he has talked so far. He has talked so far about the theory of imagination. Exactly. So according to him, exactly what is the theory of his imagination in his work? Uh, Fancy and imagination, where he talks about primary imagination, secondary imagination, and then he differs between fancy, what fancy means for him, right? So primary imagination is nothing but primary imagination ज्यामध्ये माइंड फार इन्व्हॉल्व नसतं, इनव्हॉलंटरी असतं, अनकॉन्शियसली गोष्टी परसिव्ह सेन्स केल्या जातात आणि त्यांचे एक पार्ट किंवा होल आपल्यामध्ये स्टोअर केला जातो. सेकंडरी इमॅजिनेशन हे डेलिबरेट आहे, यामध्ये माइंड ऍक्ट आहे, माइंड ऍक्टिव्ह आहे, डेलिबरेट सेन्सेशन आहे, आणि हे प्रॉमिनंटली कशावर बेस्ड आहे, तर हे प्रॉमिनंटली प्रायमरी इमॅजिनेशन वरती बेस्ड आहे. तर प्रायमरी इमॅजिनेशन मध्ये जे जे काही कलेक्ट केलं गेलं आहे, त्याला एका क्रिएटिव्ह वेने पुटअप करण्याचं, युनिफॉर्म वे मध्ये पुटअप करण्याचं काम कुठं असतं, ते सेकंडरी इमॅजिनेशन असतं. आणि फॅन्सी हे टोटली डिफरंट आहे इमॅजिनेशन पेक्षा, असं कोलरिज इथे म्हणताना दिसतोय. दिस इज व्हॉट वी हॅव सीन सो फार अबाउट हिज वर्क. Okay, now further we have his idea on the poetic genius. Exactly. So where we find him, making a difference between particularly uh, talent and in a way genius. Exactly. So genius असणं कधी जिनियस कोण आहेत आणि टॅलेंटेड कोण आहेत किंवा टॅलेंटेड कोणाला म्हणावं जिनियस कोणाला म्हणावं पोएटिक क्रिएटिव्हिटीच्या बाबतीत की टॅलेंटेड पोएट आणि जिनियस पोएट एक्झॅक्टली सो वी फाइंड हिम हिज defining the poetic genius, right? And before we decide to continue with his thought, particularly where we get to know about his various works, right? Let us take a break for 5 minutes and resume back talking about what we were talking previously, right? 5 मिनिटाचा ब्रेक घेऊयात आणि लगेच आपण 5 मिनिटांनी हिस्ट्रिकल रेजनी पोएटिक जिनियस बद्दल काय सांगितले आणि टॅलेंट बद्दल काय सांगितले याचा अभ्यास करूया. Series on understanding literary criticism and theory. We are permanently focusing on Romantic period, and a prominent figure from Romantic period is S.T. Coleridge. We are trying to understand his work, Literaria Biographia, and his various ideas that he has tried to put forth through various works that he has done so far. We have talked about his distinction between imagination, fancy and imagination, primary imagination and secondary imagination so far. Let us go and try to understand his poetic genius, where he tries to differentiate between genius and talent, right? So we have focused greatly on what he is trying to say over here. Now in his chapter 15th of the Biographia Literaria, Coleridge critically examines the Shakespeare's early works, Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Euclid, and elucidates the specific symptoms of poetic power, right? Where he distinguishes between genius and talent by making them, identical to imagination and fancy, right? To differentiate that, he says that like imagination, genius is creative and talent is like a fancy, merely a combinatory. Exactly. Genius is something inborn and talent is acquired. The following are the four ways that manifest the real poetic genius according to the Coleridge, right? And to differentiate very clear significantly, we find him making some bold statement where he says that genius is creativity and talent is like a fancy. Exactly. So he finds them the difference, to understand the difference between talent and genius. He tries to put them the two identical identities in which in which part he says genius and talent, and in which other he says imagination and fancy. He says that genius and imagination are here. They are quite equal and they are like the same. Whereas fancy and talent are like that, which are acquired. Exactly, there is a labor, and by the labor you acquire those certain skills, particularly, right? So genius is inborn, and talent is something you acquire. And there are some factors that he significantly explains over here to understand the difference between the two, right? Let's go and understand them. The sense of musical delight. Exactly, to talk about, these are the various factors according to him, which play a kind of a great role. Now, the sense of musical delight, uh, these are the ways by which a proper genius can be manifested. Now, the sense of musical delight, it consists in the perfect sweetness of versification. It is the outward manifestation of the music in the poet's soul. The man without music in his soul never be a genuine poet. The sense of musical delight is gift of imagination. And here we find him making kind of a bold explanation about being genius in case of possessing poetic genius, right? And we are seeing his particular explanations on which we find, making a statement about poetic, in a way, where he defines what is poetic genius particularly. He says, sense of musical delight. Exactly, a true genius poet will have this sense of poetic, musical delight. His sense of music will be definitely at a height, and that will make him a kind of a best poem, because the perfect sweetness of versification matters the most. And he says that the outward manifestation of the music in the poet's soul is important, and it is nothing but the result is that by that the man without music in his soul never be a genuine poet. Exactly. So the sense of musical delight is a gift of imagination. Thus, having this genius matters the most in case of comprehending the literary part. Exactly. So a genius poet will have something like this, definitely. So having a musical delight, exactly a sense of music in a poet matters the most, which makes him put his versification in a musical delight way. Exactly the sweetness of versification, exactly the perfect sweetness of versification can be achieved by the person or the poet who is blessed with this musical genius. Exactly the musical delight has to be over there. Exactly the choice of subject is another important factor. Exactly where the subject is taken immediately from the author's sensation and experiences. Through what various experiences, through what various geniuses he has been through matters the most, which allows him in selection of the subject matter. Exactly. Now going back a little bit to what romantic ideas had been shaped on. The basic philosophy of romantic movement particularly is that going back to the nature, going back to the life of countrymen, exactly making them the subject matter of your work, making them, using their language. When you are portraying a farmer, you have to speak, the farmer should speak like a normal farmer, exactly. When you are talking about a sweeper, when you are talk about a sower, when you are talking about a labor working in a farm, the kind of language he is using matters the most, which gives him kind of a completeness, exactly. And so that subject matter makes a kind of a greater difference for here. The choice of subjects is kind of an important factor which Coleridge has tried to highlight here very prominently. Exactly. Going further, we have is the shaping and modifying power of imagination. Exactly. So he says a poet's pictures of life are not faithful copies. Exactly, accurately rendered in words. They become poetic only as far as they are modified by predominant passion or by associated thoughts or images awakened by the passion, or when they have the effect of reducing multitude to unity. Exactly. There are several factors which we find, Coleridge explaining over here while talking about the simplification. Exactly. What do we find him? We find him liberalizing very sincerely, where he says that exactly a poet's picture of life are pictures. Exactly, a poet's pictures of life are not faithful copies, accurately rendered in words. Exactly, it is nothing just it is not a copying, it is not imitation, just a mere imitation. Exactly, a poetic picture, exactly, life, a poetic picture of life is just not a mere imitation. Exactly, it is not a mere imitation. Exactly, you need to have a kind of a great passion. Exactly, a passion in what various sense he says they become poetic only as far as they are modified by predominant passion, exactly that inborn passion. So, or by associated thoughts or images, various images that are awakened by the passion, or when they have the effect of reducing multitudinity or succession to an succession succession to an instant, or lastly when a human and intellectual life is transferred to them from poet's own spirit. Exactly. So it is the possession of the poet of all those qualities and passion that makes him genius particularly, right? By a long practice he can be a talented poet, but to be a genuine poet he has to have all those qualities, all these qualities inborn. A kind of a statement we find will S.T. Coleridge is making over here when he is talking about that. Exactly. And further we find him adding the depth and energy of thought. Exactly. Wordsworth had said, poems to which any value can be attached were never produced or any variety or subjects but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. Exactly. So deep thought matters the most over here. Exactly. And so the depth and energy of thought makes kind of a difference one, exactly, when it comes to talk about the poetic genius. Having a poetic genius, having that quality of a true poet makes it a more different one from the normal one, exactly. So to define that, in the initial stage only we find him saying that it is talent that matters the most, exactly, but for from that it is just an acquired thing. Talent हे काय तर talent हे acquisition आहे. तुमच्या सर्टन अमाऊंट ऑफ प्रॅक्टिस नंतर तुम्ही जे स्किल अक्वायर करता ते तुमचं टॅलेंट म्हणलं जात असतं. पण जीनियस हे इनबॉर्न आहे, ते तुमच्याकडे जन्मजात आहे, ते तुमच्या सोलमध्ये फिट आहे आणि त्याचं मॅनिफेस्टेशन तुम्हाला त्यानुसार फंक्शन करायला भाग पडतं. दॅट मॅटर्स. Exactly. And so one of the qualities of having that genius is the depth and energy of thought, where he says, exactly, with the reference of Wordsworth, that poems to which any value can be attached were never produced, okay, any variety of subjects, but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. Exactly, in the preface of 1800, we find him defining that the importance of long depth thought, a thought with long, no, depth otherwise. Exactly. तुमचे thought किती depth आहेत त्या origin फार matter करतं. Now, Coleridge agrees. He says, no man was ever yet a great poet without being at the same time a profound philosopher. And this is also very much important. Exactly. And having the quality of a philosopher, according to him, makes him a kind of a great poet. The poets, before becoming a poet, are the philosophers. Exactly. And that makes them go with the depth and of thought otherwise. Exactly. त्यांच्यामध्ये ती डेप्थ एनर्जी थॉटची कुठून दिसून येते जे विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थ एस टी कोलरेजचं एक सगळ्यात महत्वाचं वाक्य इथं आपण बघू शकतो एक्झॅक्टली इन इज लिटररी बायोग्राफी दॅट no man was ever yet exactly this remains a kind of a important statement for us that no man what he is trying to say over here that no man was ever yet a great poet without being at the same time a profound philosopher. Exactly, a profound philosopher means someone with a great depth of. This remains very significant. यातलं वाक्य फार महत्वाचं आहे की पोएट हा सायमल्टेनियसली एक विचारवंत सुद्धा आहे एक फिलॉसॉफर सुद्धा आहे एक तत्वनिष्ठ आहे एक विचारवंत तत्ववेत्ता आहे एक्झॅक्टली त्याच्यामध्ये डेप्थ प्रोफाऊंड थॉटची प्रोफाऊंड फिलॉसॉफीची प्रोफाऊंड काय इन डेप्थ थॉट करण्याची जे स्किल आहे जे जेन्युअन आहे बाय बर्थ आहे इनबॉर्न आहे ते मॅटर करतं व्हॉट ही फर्दर ॲड्स व्हॉट such a man feels in a moment of inspiration, howsoever powerfully, is naturally modified and directed by what he has thought long and deeply. Exactly. And so we find William Wordsworth making the same statement in the definition of poetry that, you know, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings re-originated in tranquility. It means you have got powerful emotions, you have got powerful feelings, you store them, you sit them, you give a great thought to them, and then you try to produce them into the poetic or artistic work particularly. So poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings re-originated in tranquility makes it a sense when he says that a poet cannot be without a long depth thought, a profound thought process. एक depth thought process असल्याशिवाय तो poet होऊ शकत नाही ज्याचं genius आहे. Exactly. And to add to this, we find him making very boldly over here what he has to say exactly that he makes that exactly what such a man feels in a moment of inspiration, howsoever powerfully, is naturally modified and directed by what he has thought long and deeply. Exactly. So, what makes his sense? Exactly. Yes, feels in a moment. Exactly. So, we have got, let's say, feelings, exactly, or in a way, emotions exactly and what are they governed by these feelings and emotions what he makes kind of like modified and directed by he has thought long and deeply exactly a long again a long and a deep thought काय गवर्न करतंय एखाद्या पोएटकडे एक्स्ट्रीम इमोशन्स आहेत फिलिंग्स आहेत एक्झॅक्टली सच अ मॅन फील्स इन अ मोमेंट ऑफ इन्स्पिरेशन त्याला जे काही मोटिवेटिंग वाटलं त्याने जे काही थॉट केला तो थॉट कशाने गवर्न केला गेलेला पाहिजे तर तो गेला गेला पाहिजे लॉंग डीप थॉटने अँड दॅट्स मेक्स इट अ ग्रेट सेन्स अदरवाइज सो unless inspiration occurs to a contemplative mind, it must lack what gives it strength depth and energy of thought. Poetry for Coleridge is the union of deep feelings, not only pleases or elevates. एक्झॅक्टली तो काय म्हणतोय पुन्हा एकदा इन डिटेलमध्ये आपण बघून घ्या एक्झॅक्टली एक्झॅक्टली सो ही व्हॉट ही सेज आधीच्या स्टेटमेंट तो काय बोलला होता काय म्हणतोय बघा की तो तुमच्या इमोशन्स फिलिंग ज्यातून इन्स्पायर झाल्या त्या आहेतच पण जेव्हा त्या मॉडिफाईड केल्या जातात डीप थॉटने जेव्हा त्या डायरेक्ट किंवा मॉडिफाय केल्या जातात तेव्हा त्या खऱ्या पोएटिक मध्ये उतरतात ओके ही सेज अनलेस येस व्हॉट यू फाइंड हिम इन अ ग्रेट वे ही सेज अनलेस inspiration occurs to a contemplative mind, it must. What must lack? The inspiration must lack what gives it strength, the depth and energy of thought. Exactly. And poetry for Coleridge is the union of deep feelings, not only pleases but elevates. त्यातून फक्त आनंदच मिळत नाही तर philosophically enrich करतं. Exactly. So delight is there, but also instruct and didact is also there. That again recollects with the original thought of what Aristotle or Plato had tried to say in their philosophical approach of artistic work. Right? So, हे एक statement झालं. Exactly. So, what makes distinct Coleridge from his contemporary critic is the psychological approach to literary problems. So त्याच्या कंटेम्पररी लोकांपासून कोलरेज का वेगळा होतो तर त्याचा सायकोलॉजिकल अप्रोच टू द प्रॉब्लेम्स एक्झॅक्टली याच्या मागचं सायकोलॉजिकल रिझनिंग काय आहे ते जाणून घेऊन त्याला एक्सप्लेन करण्याची त्याची स्टाईल एक्झॅक्टली येस अँड his psychological approach to the problems, T.S. Eliot pointed out in his work the use of poetry and the use of criticism that with the help of his profound knowledge in philosophy and metaphysics. T.S. Eliot S.T. Coleridgeचं कौतुक करताना काय सांगतोय एक्झॅक्टली pointed out in his work the use of poetry and the use of criticism that with the help of his profound knowledge in philosophy and metaphysics. Exactly. So, in the initial stage that we have seen, he remains, S.T. Coleridge remains to be the first critic, first poet or a critic literary critic who had thought, first English critic who had thought of literary criticism or brought a kind of a philosophical angle in his writings, right? And so he remains one of the prominent figure to be understood in case of giving much of importance to what he had tried to say otherwise, right? So it is much more of an importance to understand what S.T. Coleridge has tried to say, right? So Coleridge did more than any of his predecessors or bring attention to the profundity of the philosophic problems into which study of poetry may take us. Exactly. That's what T.S. Eliot has marked. Exactly. Let's go and try to understand again what T.S. Eliot has tried to, in a way, explain particularly. Right? काय म्हणतोय T.S. Eliot बघा the use of poetry and use of criticism exactly yeah, to bring attention to the profundity of philosophic problems into which the study of poetry may take us. That with the help of his profound knowledge in poetics, Coleridge did more than any of predecessors to bring attention to the profundity, exactly, so profound knowledge, profound thought, emotions controlled by depth thought, जिकडे वर्ड्सवर्थ आणि ते दोघं एका मतावरती ठाम होतात दॅट पोएटिक्सचा जीनियस कुठलं कुठलं आहे एक्झॅक्टली दिस वॉज दी in-depth study of what S.T. Coleridge, being the first generation romantics, had tried to explain us through his work, particularly. त्याच्या कामातून त्यांना जे आपल्याला सांगण्याचा प्रयत्न केला त्याचा थोडासा अंदाज आपण आता घेतला सो आत्ताच्या या सेशनमध्ये आपण काय काय बघितलं होतं तर आत्ताच्या आपण या सेशनमध्ये लेट अस रिवाइज व्हॉट वी हॅव बीन डिस्कसिंग सो फार इन दिस सेशन व्हेरी पर्टिक्युलरली दॅट वी हॅव ट्राईड टू फोकस पर्टिक्युलरली ऑन right we revised about what is romanticism, how romanticism got introduced to the 18th and 19th century literature, how it became, how it got emerged, exactly how it got started, what were the roots of starting, what were the reasons of, what were the reasons of its emergence particularly, exactly how it got emerged, the reason behind the several romantic ideas that got greatly profoundly starting with all those things, right? And we also try to understand, right? So summarizing what we have been discussing so far in this lecture series, uh, or in this today's session, that we try to understand, in a way. Just a moment, right? So first thing that we did is we try to understand uh, what is mean by a romantic period of literally क्रिटिसिझम particularly, राईट. लिटररी क्रिटिसिझम मध्ये रोमॅन्टिक पिरियड म्हणजे काय आहे, रोमॅन्टिक पिरियडचं महत्त्व काय होतं, याच्या फिलॉसॉफीज कुठल्या कुठल्या आहेत, याचं जरा बेसिक रिव्हिजन आपण आजच्या लेक्चरमध्ये घेतलं. त्यानंतर आपण प्रॉमिनंट फिगर्सबद्दल बोललो. त्यामध्ये एक येत होतं म्हणजे कुठलं तर विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थ. खरं तर आपण प्रिव्हियस लेक्चरमध्ये विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थ आणि त्याच्या कामाबद्दल एकदम इन डेप्थ आढावा घेतलेला आहे. सो विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थ, his approach in lyrical ballads or pervasive lyrical ballads, Tintin Abbey, his ideas on his ideas on romanticism, his ideas on use of meter and versification, his ideas on language of poetry, his ideas on subject of poetry, theme of poetry, his bringing natural elements into his poetry and his poetic work. So many things that were there that we have talked so far in case of understanding the work by विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थ particularly, right? So विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थच्या कामाचा एक थोडासा इतिहास आपण त्या निमित्ताने इथे बघितला. Exactly. So understanding about William Wordsworth was prominent thing. And now in this lecture series, we try to understand what Samuel uh, the other Coleridge. Exactly, who is considered as one of the prominent figures. Exactly. So we try to understand the history of Romantic period, work of William Wordsworth, and we discussed in detail about Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in which he has talked about uh, imagination, exactly, and also has tried to differ between imagination and fancy, exactly what means is particularly in imagination. We have seen him talking about particularly what is mean by primary uh, and the secondary imagination, exactly. Primary imagination, in which the mind, unconscious mind, exactly, or otherwise we can say in a way इनव्हॉलंटरी माइंड पर्टिक्युलरली, राईट. यामध्ये माइंडचा रोल आहे तो कसा आहे या ठिकाणी, तर तो कसा आहे, इनव्हॉलंटरी आहे, अनकॉन्शियस आहे. एक्झॅक्टली जे थॉट्स परसिव्ह केले जातात ते, राईट. वी टॉक्ट अबाउट particularly imagination and fancy, where we have seen him defining particularly that, labelizing the primary imagination and secondary imagination. ज्यामध्ये प्रायमरी इमॅजिनेशन मध्ये काय दिसतं तर अनकॉन्शियसनेस दिसतो किंवा इनव्हॉलंटरीनेस दिसतो, वेअर ॲज सेकंडरी इमॅजिनेशन विच इज लेड ऑन फॉर शुअर प्रायमरी इमॅजिनेशन, जे प्रायमरी इमॅजिनेशनवरती आधारित आहे. एक्झॅक्टली. आणि त्यानंतर आपण अजून एक थॉट त्यामध्ये बघितला काय, तर हे कसं आहे, तर याच्यामध्ये माइंड तुमचं काय आहे तर ॲक्टिव्ह आहे. एक्झॅक्टली. सेकंडरी इमॅजिनेशनमध्ये माइंड ॲक्टिव्ह आहे. एक्झॅक्टली. अँड दस इट इज दी अटमोस्ट एक्झाम्पल ऑफ क्रिएटिव्हिटी. एक्झॅक्टली. सो तिकडे एक्स्ट्रीम क्रिएटिव्ह आहे. आर्टिस्टिक क्रिएटिव्ह प्रोडक्शनचं सगळ्यात मोठं सोर्स कुठला आहे तर ते आहे म्हणजे काय, तर सेकंडरी इमॅजिनेशन, राईट. So we tried him making a distinction between all those factors, particularly when we try to understand the greatest or the genius of S.T. Coleridge, particularly, right? So we are trying to understand the genius of S.T. Coleridge. S.T. Coleridgeचं काय काम महत्त्वाचं ते आपण बघितलं. Exactly. So the first of all differentiation between imagination and fancy बघितलं. His greatest work, uh, Biographia Literaria, ज्यामध्ये तो प्रॉमिनंटली सांगतो ते बघितलं. त्यानंतर we have seen his genius of poet. Really. I'm sorry. It was about his I'm sorry. His elements about पोएटिक जीनियस. पोएटिक जीनियस म्हणजे काय? म्युझिकल डिलाइट, सब्जेक्ट मॅटर, डेप्थ ऑफ थॉट, या सगळ्या गोष्टी आपण आत्ताच्या या सगळ्या संपूर्ण लेक्चर सिरीजमधल्या. दिस वॉज ऑल अबाउट अंडरस्टँडिंग हिज द ग्रेटेस्ट ऑफ वर्क्स ऑल टाइम. एक्झॅक्टली. So Samuel Taylor Coleridge remains one of the prominent factors who has talked about various particular things. Okay, that was just only a short account of his works particularly, which is quite important, keeping the net set examination into consideration. त्याने काय काय सांगितलंय, because there are statements that makes us, you know, quite important to understand what he has tried to explain. Exactly. So या परीक्षेच्या माध्यमातून एस टी कोलरेजच्या कुठला आहे, तर आपण बघितलं की एस टी कोलरेजचा अजून काय क्वालिटी आहे, तर त्याच्याकडे असा पहिला क्रिटिक म्हणून बघितला जातो की जो फिलॉसॉफिकल अँगलनी क्रिटिसिझमला इंट्रोड्यूस केलं होतं. राईट. लिटरी क्रिटिसिझमला इंट्रोड्यूस करत असताना फिलॉसॉफिकल अँगलनी लिटरी क्रिटिसिझमला इंट्रोड्यूस करणं असं बघतात. एक्झॅक्टली. अँड ऑल्सो रिमेन्स वन ऑफ द प्रॉमिनंट फिगर who also remains one of the prominent figure of literary criticism in Romantic period particularly. Exactly. So this was all about S.T. Coleridge and his greatest of all time works. एक्झॅक्टली. एस टी कोलरेजचं एकदम महत्त्वाचं काम लिटररी बायोग्राफिया, त्याने शेक्सपियरवरती केलेलं त्याचं भाष्य, आणि त्यातून त्याने सांगितलेलं जीनियस. एक्झॅक्टली. पोएटिक जीनियसबद्दल त्यानं केलेल्या कॉमेंट्स, म्हणजे की पोएटकडे तो एक म्युझिकल टच असला पाहिजे, म्युझिकचा सेन्स असला पाहिजे, म्युझिकल डिलाइटचा सेन्स असला पाहिजे, ज्यातून त्याचं व्हर्सिफिकेशन उत्तमरित्या होतं. सब्जेक्ट मॅटरची जाण असली पाहिजे, इन डेप्थ थॉट असायला हवा. एक्झॅक्टली. सो त्यानुसारच त्याची म्हणजे इन डेप्थ थॉटमध्ये की थॉट या इमोशन्सला कंट्रोल करतात. इमोशन्स आणि फिलिंगच्या वेगळ्या इन्स्पिरेशन असतील तरीही थॉटनी, लॉंग डेप्थ थॉटनी जर का ते रिकलेक्ट केलं असेल, जिथे आपण विल्यम वर्ड्सवर्थला आणि एस टी कोलरेजला एका पॉईंटला अग्री होताना बघतो की येस, द पोएटिक क्रिएटिव्हिटी इज ऑल्सो असोसिएटेड विथ लॉंग डेप्थ थॉट. Exactly, which results into a kind of a poetry. Exactly. So in a way, we have tried to fabricate those various ideas very particularly, right? So we are focusing on prominent figures from Romantic period particularly, right? So this is all about what Coleridge has tried to explain us. Now, in our upcoming lecture series, otherwise, particularly, we'll be trying to focus on again one of the prominent figure is Shelley. Exactly. पी बी शेली. पी बी शेलीचं काय काम आहे, पी बी शेलीने काय काय कॉन्ट्रीब्युशन दिले. आता आपल्याकडे वेळ कमी आहे, त्यामुळे आपण त्याच्यामध्ये सुरुवात करत नाही. पण पी बी शेली ऑल्सो रिमेन्स वन ऑफ दी prominent figure. Let us go and talk about him in our upcoming lecture series, where we are going to find out what kind of a contribution PBCD has. Right. Exactly. Till then, let's say adieu and say thank you. Thank you for being the patient listeners. Otherwise.